Hey, friends. So, coming out of the last couple of days of reflections, a thought came up for me today, or not really a thought. It was like a recognition of something that I think it's easy to. What I find for myself is I find myself getting caught on one side or the other of this seesaw, I'm going to call it. And basically, what I'm talking about is, like as we begin to take seriously the process, the practice of some kind of consciousness work, conscious evolution, once we kind of get familiar with it, we develop our own practices, we develop our own approach, right? We kind of or we find a tradition that works for us, find a community, find a teacher, find a religion, whatever it is that gives us the sense this is where I belong, this nourishes me deeply, this helps me evolve my own consciousness. Once we get there, and especially I think in the case of folks like myself who are kind of DIYers when it comes to this work. Because God knows I've had a slew of amazing teachers and I've brushed up against and sometimes had some pretty long-term and deep relationships with various spiritual traditions, but I've also never gone all in on one. I've never said, I am now a follower of a Tibetan Buddhist lineage and that's what I'm doing with this area of my life. Although I've had a number of encounters with people who have been very deeply affiliated with that tradition and for whom that really has been their sort of all-consuming life practice. But I've also bumped up against some stuff that would be probably considered new agey cult spirituality, and had some really powerful experiences there. Some really deep and moving and life-changing experiences. And on occasion I've also sort of been with a group for a while and then moved on. Other times I've really only had a pretty kind of it's been a glancing blow, a tangential relationship. I just come into contact and then kind of move away again, but I get something from it. So in other words, I've had a lot of influences that go into shaping how I've approached my practice. And one of the things that when I said at the beginning of getting caught on one side or the other, one of the things that I find continuously new is the meaning of, on some level, spiritual practice is a completely, wholly individual practice. It's something that we do for ourselves, in ourselves. It's our own autonomy, our own agency, our own consciousness that we are really working with. That's where our focus goes. That's the only thing we can change. We can't change anybody else. No matter how close we are with our community or how healthy our community may seem to us, we can't ultimately control what happens in anyone else's spiritual life or spiritual practice. All we can control is our own. our own individual practice and our own individual experience. That's all we can ever know, even. So that's one side, right? This is the individualistic, or the side of the coin that where spiritual practice is all about being an individual. And the way in which we grow is taking more and more internal individual responsibility for everything out there. Everything that happens in circumstances, we don't say, okay, that's happening to me, or this is, I couldn't control it, or we just take, we take within ourselves, we locate within ourselves the capacity to take responsibility for everything that happens to us. But there's another side to this, which is ultimately we're not serving just ourselves. That would be solipsistic, egoistic, and ultimately kind of self-centered and self-absorbed if our own individual self is the only thing we care about, or the kind of only purpose of spiritual practice. Because we, at least this is my experience, I need to be on some level serving not just my egoic self, but rather giving outward, being in a position, or being in a state of willingness to give everything away to a community, to my community, to my small, immediate family community, to the larger community, to the whole planet, to the whole cosmos, because ultimately consciousness is evolving not just here, right? There's no reason to think that consciousness is located on Earth in any kind of unique way. And in fact, if you look at developmental psychology, various spiritual people, I'm reading the book The Gift by Lewis Hyde, he makes this point that generally as our consciousness grows, our sense of identity grows, and little by little we contain within the boundary of what we call our self or our community a greater and greater percentage of the knowable universe. We don't draw those boundaries narrowly, we draw them wider and wider. And Lewis Hyde incidentally goes into some really interesting investigation of how wide a community can get before the bond starts to become diluted. One of the principles of his kind of gift-giving economic, the way when he looks at gift economies, he says that the widening the circle of gift giving often dilutes the power of the gift. It dilutes the bond that is created by the gift giving ceremony, or by the gift giving practice. And ultimately, then not to divert into that, but ultimately then we end up kind of needing a different kind of economy. And that's actually how he explains how we got to where we are today, and the different kinds of economies that we have, and the gift giving versus commodities, and blah blah blah. That's kind of, I sort of landed there because it's related, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm really listening to and sort of noticing today a sense that I travel between the wholly individual domain of spiritual practice into the more kind of communal, in relationship, in connection domain of practice, life practice, spiritual practice, and back again, and back again, and back again. And but I notice here and there that when I'm in one of those, whichever mode I'm in, it's almost like I can't see the other one. It's almost like cognitively you can't do them both at the same time. And that's interesting to me. It's interesting to me, and I think that it also, if it explains somewhat in a very kind of oblique way why political polarization, which often breaks down along lines of an individualistic perspective on rights, responsibilities, what we should do in life, how life should be, and a more communal sense of rights, responsibilities, how life should be, what we should be doing to increase the communal membrane, the communal care that a society has for itself, how we protect ourselves, how we care for ourselves, and over here, what we allow it, where we don't diminish individual rights simply in service of the collective. Which you look at political systems all around the globe, you're going to see lots and lots and lots of different examples of how people solve these problems. But especially in our country, the debate about what to do is so polarized. And so it's interesting for me to observe that even in myself, where I know that these are two sides of a polarity, they're not mutually exclusive, and in fact they co-imply and co-require each other. But even knowing that and having spent years reflecting on this and observing the way that my mind moves from one to the other, I can still get caught on one side or the other and almost not be able to see the other side. And I think that's another sign that we're dealing with a polarity. But we're not dealing with beliefs that can be adapted to kind of accommodate a multiplicity of perspectives. And obviously I try to do that. I do try to adapt my beliefs to accommodate a multiplicity of perspectives. But when I'm in one perspective or the other, I'm really there. And it is a place to look from. If you're standing somewhere and there's, let's say that there's a North Pole and a South Pole and something in the middle, and you're standing on the South Pole, you're going to see the object from the south. You might be able to imagine what it's like on the north side, but you can't actually see it from that perspective. In order to do that, you have to go over there, at which point you can no longer see it from the other direction. That's the nature of perspectives. They are actually located somewhere. And they're not perspectives that are, or we're talking about like a global, malleable, multi-move, we're talking about actually just where I am, where I'm looking. And when I locate myself at one end of the polarity or on the other end of the polarity, I'm actually really kind of there exclusively. And I have just, the reason this is interesting to me is kind of everything I just dove into a bit kind of, I'm running roughshod over a lot of kind of important ideas here, but I noticed this in myself first, and then extrapolating that out to seeing, oh, well, it is really hard to get people who are really kind of over here to talk to people who are really over here. Like that's a tricky, they don't always want to talk. They don't always want to hear what each other have to say. And if they do, they just miss the point completely. I feel like when I look at our American political landscape, that's what I see. Not people who believe the other side is bad or necessarily, or believe that they have all the right answers, but people who just can't see from that other perspective, you're kind of stuck where you are. And now, obviously, what we can do is move. And every time we move, we can remember what it felt like to be somewhere else. So it's not impossible to reconcile these things. It's quite possible. It requires a little bit of willingness to go somewhere that might be unfamiliar or uncomfortable, but it's totally possible. And it's totally possible to kind of have an omni perspective that does acknowledge that each of these perspectives are fully valid, and that each of them have something to contribute to what we might call a holistic perspective, which is one that we might gradually mold, and certainly we could mold policy that would reflect that. But it's also just good to remember that it might be hard to be in those various places at various times. We actually have to be where we are and then let ourselves be moved. So this is just what showed up for me today, and you can tell I'm kind of riffing on it and figuring out the implications of it, but kind of exciting to notice, and I think it has some relevance to various germane aspects of our social health right now. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. I'll see you very soon.